there were lots of people, born with XXY or XX with strange male, testosterone hormones and all that sort of stuff, and there's all sorts of that. But they're we could call them abnormalities. And they might not challenge our fundamental notions of the kind of bipolarity of normal sex. Let's set aside culturally constructed gender, but let's talk biology.
Right. Well, since you're a philosopher, I'm sure you've heard of the problem of natural kinds.
Yeah, definitely.
And the question is, are there really two natural kinds and everything else doesn't fit into those two? Or are there all of the different things we see in nature, in fact, natural and not abnormal? And to a large extent, we as scientists or as medical professionals make a decision about what we count as normal or not normal based on our social or cultural understandings of what we think the world should look like, rather than on anything that sort of is self-evident from nature.
And let me share with our listeners my understanding of natural kinds.
Sure.
Of course, it comes from nature, and the idea is that nature on its own produces things of various kinds. Now, that's got to be right to some extent. I mean, rocks and grass are quite different. But then elm trees and oak trees. Well, that's a pretty robust natural kind, but there's lots of distinctions among trees we make that, really are pretty much just the result of the way humans breed trees. So how natural are they? And then at the other extreme, there's like the difference between Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola. Is that a natural kind? No, it seems like a socially constructed kind of virtually identical liquids.
Yeah, we think that, some philosophers think that nature has joints, and the job of science is to carve nature up into its pre-given joints, right?
That's right.
And you might think that male versus female is one of biology's pre-given joints.
And as a biologist, I am not particularly convinced that nature has those joints. I think that what we do is, as biologists, is our best to offer good categories to that enable us to carry out research projects and enable us to understand the world. But whether those are are in fact natural joints that nature that the world is carved into, or whether we're imposing them on a world that's quite a bit more complex and messy, I think is an open question. And I'm inclined to say that we're imposing order where there's some order, but less than we think meets the eye.
So that the way nature works is there are statistical clumps that are quite significant that center around these pure male and pure female paradigms, and the ones in between are, I guess, fairly rare. But how rare are they? What percentage of 100 people would be in this somewhat ambiguous state?
Well, this, of course, depends on who you count as ambiguous. Now, the gentleman who was interviewed with Klinefelters, that's primarily a chromosomal difference. If you count everybody who doesn't quite fit the so-called pure male or pure female, including at the chromosomal level, which is actually quite common, you come up with something approximating 2%, or so. It would be, 2 out of 100, which is actually quite high if you think about it.
2 out of 100, as I understand, the Jewish population in America is roughly between 2 and 3%. That's they make a significant cultural impact. What happens to this 2 or 3%? Why are they not self-identified? Do the members of this percent know that they fit into this group?
And I'm going to let that question hang for a little bit. Then we can address it in a little bit.
Okay.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking with Anne Fausto-Sterling of Brown University about sex and gender. She's just helped us to see that sex and gender are more fluid than we imagine. So here's the question for you. Should we abandon our bipolar sexual vocabulary altogether and open ourselves to a variety of new sexual kinds?
Please join us.
By giving us a call at 415-841-4134. That's 415-841-4134.
Or send us an email at comments@philosophytalk.org.
Philosophy Talk will be right back.
With your long blonde hair, you look like a girl. You may be a boy, you look like a girl.
The Barbarians with Are You a Boy or Are You a Girl? Boy, the Barbarians, that's a blast from the past. Ken brings back memories. You know, they're the only band I remember with a one-handed drummer.
Yeah, right.
So you talk about being willing to deal with statistical irregularities. Anyway, you're listening to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. Our guest is Anne Fausto-Sterling of Brown University. We're talking about sex and gender. Is gender really a binary system, or is it more ambiguous than that? Give us a call and tell us what you think. We're eager to hear from you.
The number is 415-841-4134. I'll repeat that, 415-841-4134. Or email us at comments@philosophytalk.org.
So, Anne, I want to go back to John's question before the break, and I'll phrase it. The number of people who are of ambiguous gender, let's put it that way for the time being, intersexuals, is nearly 2%, you say. But they seem pretty invisible in our broader culture. That's a lot of people. If you take the population of the United States, why are they so invisible?
Well, they are invisible often because their situation may result, as a gentleman who was interviewed, from a chromosomal difference that isn't even recognized until something like fertility becomes an issue. So people can grow up being different from that ideal norm and not know it until fairly late in life. If kids are actually born with ambiguous genitalia or some unusual component to their gonads, then they may be diagnosed early in life. And the medical practice is to try to, quote, fix it, to make them conform, and to make them invisible because of the pre-existing belief that there should only be two. So we try to make only two, even when there's not two.
So a lot of people in this intersex region probably don't know or aren't vividly aware of the fact that they were born that way, and others probably know and just try to forget it.
That's correct.
And the medical profession helps them by doing these surgeries. I mean, reading your book, it was sort of a catalog of horrors at certain times. I mean, it seemed to me.
Well, there are many of us who don't believe that the medical profession necessarily helps by doing these surgeries to correct genitalia. The surgeries are imperfect, and they're often done on babies who have no choice in the matter. So the question about whether these surgeries are necessary for the mental health of the child is a really big one, and it's one that's being hotly debated right now within the pediatric surgical world.
So look, and I want to ask you a more philosophical question, though.
Sure.
Because I wonder what the deep what about the rest of us who have, let's call it standard. I don't know if I want to use the word normal given what you've said. Let's call it standard sort of gender and sex identities. I mean, is there any challenge to that from what you're saying? I mean, you could think of it like this, and I'm not sure if you do or don't. You could think of it like people say, well, used to say, racial categories are biological categories. That's nonsense, it turns out. And one of the reasons you can see that is because our concepts of race don't have a way, sort of fixed ordinary concepts of race, can't deal with interracial people. It doesn't know what to call them, right? It's completely embarrassed by the phenomena of interracial people. And so you say, well, we should abandon this old race schema. Are you suggesting a similar kind of argument for gender concepts?
There is a similar kind of argument to be made, although the analogy is incomplete. But within people who have what you call the standard set of attributes, there is also huge variability in body type, in interest, in mental and physical inclination. And even in things like how deep your voice is. I mean, I have women friends who have extremely deep voices who would be always mistaken for men, and I know men who have pretty high-pitched voices. So what the things we think of as, quote, the standard, what I call the Platonic ideal, are just that. They're an ideal that don't particularly match the huge variability within our populations.
The number at Philosophy Talk is 415-841-4134. Our guest is Anne Fausto-Sterling. Give us a call. Anne, let me ask a question here. with the case that Ken mentioned of people that don't fit into the standard racial stereotypes, we can say that's a very dynamic phenomenon. I mean, it's increasing in California. You know, probably the majority of people that we call minority don't fit into cleanly into any of these stereotypes, and maybe most of the people we call majority. What's the case with is it always going to be around 2 or 3%? Is cultural inhibitions to recognizing the reality of this disappear? Will this number increase? Is it hereditary in any way?
Well, let me distinguish between intersex and then gender, the dynamics of gender. Intersex is sometimes an accident of birth. It's sometimes genetic, and as in those cases, it may have very different frequencies in different populations where a particular gene is more frequent or not.